The morning my boss told me I could either attend my father's funeral or keep my job, she did it while stirring powdered creamer into her coffee, like she was discussing printer paper. That detail stayed with me longer than it should have. Not the words themselves, though those were bad enough. Not even the fact that my father had died 3 hours earlier and I was still wearing the same wrinkled navy shirt I had slept in after the hospital called. It was the little plastic spoon. The calm. The lazy circle she made in that paper cup while I stood in her doorway, trying not to come apart. 4 days, she said, glancing down at my request form and then up at me with that pinched, mildly irritated expression people get when your grief lands too close to their schedule. Absolutely not. I thought she had misunderstood me. My father passed away this morning, I said, hearing how flat my own voice sounded. The service is in Missouri. I need to drive down, help with the arrangements, and be with family. She took a sip, grimaced because the coffee was probably terrible, and shrugged. You can have 48 hours. Past that, you're choosing personal priorities over project obligations. Personal priorities. My father had raised me alone from the time I was 11. He had worked double shifts with a torn rotator cuff because he couldn't afford the surgery yet. He had learned how to braid my little sister's hair from VHS tapes. He had sat in a metal folding chair outside my high school robotics competition with a stained thermos and a mechanic's hands folded over one knee, like watching me solder a sensor module mattered as much as oxygen. And this woman, who once cried in an all-hands because the espresso machine on 12 was broken, was telling me his funeral was a personal priority. I should tell you this now, because it matters later. When she said that, something in me did not explode. It went still. That kind of stillness is more dangerous, because anger burns hot and quick. Anger shouts. Anger gives people a warning. What settled into me in that doorway was colder than that. Colder and cleaner. It was the moment I stopped believing effort would ever make them human. I nodded once. Calm. So calm it startled even me. Understood, I said. Then I walked out of her office, crossed 27 gray carpet tiles, past the wall with our company values stenciled in white vinyl, and kept going until I reached the parking garage. I sat in my car with both hands on the wheel and watched the rain stripe the windshield. By the time the wipers made a third pass, I already knew exactly what I was going to take back. My name is Adrian Mercer. I was 34 years old when my father died, and for almost 6 years before that morning, I had been the invisible spine of a software logistics company called Alder Dynamics. On paper, I was a senior operations systems analyst. In practice, I was the person people called when their shortcuts finally broke something expensive. We built workflow infrastructure for mid-sized distribution companies. That was the clean version. The truer version was that we sold certainty to executives who liked dashboards more than reality. And every quarter, we promised faster integrations than our staffing or documentation could actually support. We papered over the gaps with cross-functional resilience, which was corporate dialect for 3 competent people carrying 20 underprepared ones while leadership held town halls about culture. I was one of the 3. There are offices that feel like communities. There are offices that feel like stage sets. Alder felt like a hotel ballroom after an event, all the time. Bright enough, clean enough, full of temporary furniture and tired smiles and air conditioning that never matched the weather outside. People disappeared into conference rooms, came out using phrases they had heard from someone with a bonus structure, and called that collaboration. The walls were glass, which management loved because it looked open. It mostly meant you could watch Panic Travel. I had not meant to become essential there. At first, I just wanted a stable job. My sister, Nora, was in nursing school then, and our father was still pretending his blood pressure was a little stress instead of the long fuse it turned out to be. I took the Alder job because it had health insurance, a decent base salary, and the kind of bland respectability that let people stop worrying about you. I thought I would do good work, keep my head down, and build a quiet life. Then people started leaving. First, it was one implementation manager who got burned out and took a city job. Then a database specialist who left after being asked to cover 2 roles for 1 paycheck. Then a documentation lead whose resignation email made the rounds because it contained the line, "Hope is not a process." Nobody replaced them properly. Their responsibilities just spread outward like floodwater. I noticed because I was the kind of person who notices systems failing before they fall apart. I built checklists because nobody else had. I wrote cleanup scripts because repeating the same manual fixes made me want to scream. I created escalation maps, rollback guides, dependency trackers, handoff notes, and client-specific workarounds that existed nowhere in the official knowledge base, because the official knowledge base was a half-empty SharePoint graveyard maintained by a committee. If I found a problem twice, I documented it. If someone asked me the same question 3 times, I built a reference for it. If a client had one weird legacy warehouse field that crashed a migration every 3rd Thursday because their local admin exported in the wrong encoding, I remembered it. Not because I was noble, because chaos offended me, and because my father had raised me to believe that if you knew where the load-bearing wall was, you had a responsibility not to let idiots knock it down. He was a maintenance supervisor at a public school district for 32 years. Not glamorous, not easy, the kind of job people only noticed when something stopped working. He taught me how to patch drywall, change brake pads, and keep receipts in a coffee tin because memory lies when money's involved. He also taught me something more useful than any certification I ever earned. Watch what people do when it costs them something, he used to say. That's when you learn who they are. At Alder, I learned fast. My boss, Dana Wexler, was vice president of operations. She had the polished kind of competence that thrives in rooms where outcomes can be narrated better than measured. Beautiful hair, expensive shoes, voice like cut glass. She remembered birthdays if HR reminded her. She could make exploitation sound like opportunity in under 30 seconds. People called her brilliant because she never looked flustered in meetings. The reason she never looked flustered was simple. Other people absorbed the consequences before they reached her. Above Dana was our COO, Martin Keene, who treated every problem like it had personally embarrassed him. He loved phrases like strategic urgency and execution discipline. He also had the habit, common among men who have never rebuilt anything themselves, of assuming the people doing the actual rebuilding were interchangeable. Then there was Priya. You only need to know a few names in a story like this, and hers matters. Priya Shah sat 2 rows over from me the first year I joined Alder. Integration engineer. Smarter than almost everybody, quiet until she wasn't, laugh that always sounded like she meant it. She had a habit of twisting the cap off her water bottle whenever she was about to say something sharp. We started by complaining about the coffee, then about the ticketing system, then about the company, then somehow about everything else. For a while, she was the one person in that building who made it feel survivable. We never dated. People always expect that. We never did. What we had was stranger and maybe more important. She saw what I was carrying before I admitted it to myself. She noticed when I started answering emails at 2 in the morning. She noticed when I stayed late to clean up someone else's Bosch deployment and then showed up the next day pretending I was fine. She used to lean against the divider by my desk and say, "You know they don't love you back, right?" I would smile without looking up. "I'm aware." "No," she'd say. "You think you are. That's different." At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. Turns out she was early. The months before my father died were a slow-motion warning I kept ignoring. He had been tired more often. Not old tired, bone tired. The kind that made him sit down halfway through telling a story and wave you off when you asked if he was okay. He missed one of Nora's clinical pinning events because of dizziness, which was unlike him enough that she called me afterward and said, "I think he's scared." But he was my father. Men like him believed pain was mostly a scheduling problem. He kept saying he would get things checked after the district's summer maintenance cycle wrapped, after the roof repairs, after the boiler inspections, after he helped Aunt Louise replace her back fence because the storm had taken half of it down. Always after. Then one Thursday, I got a voicemail from him at 6:14 p.m. "Hey kid, don't laugh, but I finally made that chili you keep pretending isn't good. Too much cumin. Tastes like drywall. Call me when you're out." I missed it because I was on a migration war room call trying to explain to Martin why cutting QA time by 2/3 did not, in fact, create execution focus. By the time I called back, it went straight to voicemail. I texted, "Nothing." I figured he had fallen asleep in front of baseball, which he did all the time. At 2:11 a.m., my phone rang again. Unknown number. A hospital. He had collapsed in his kitchen. By the time I got there, he was already gone. There are moments your body remembers in pieces instead of sequence. The orange vending machine glow in the waiting area. A nurse touching my elbow with professional softness. The smell of bleach and stale coffee. The way his wallet and wedding ring sat in a clear plastic belongings bag on the counter like the world had reduced him to objects. I called Nora from the parking lot with my forehead against cold glass. She cried hard and fast. I didn't. Not then. She was 4 hours away in St. Louis on a trauma rotation. She couldn't leave until the attending signed off. And because life is sometimes ugly in ways fiction doesn't dare, most of the immediate logistics fell to me. Funeral home, death certificate, locking up the house, calling our uncle, finding the Navy suit he wore to her nursing school ceremony because he had only owned one truly good suit in the last 20 years, and that one mattered. By dawn, I had not slept. By 7:30, I was standing in Dana's doorway while she stirred creamer into her coffee and told me my father's funeral was a personal priority. What she did not know was that I had been preparing to leave Alder for months. Not dramatically, quietly. There's a specific kind of employee every dysfunctional company creates sooner or later. The one who becomes both indispensable and impossible to promote because too much hidden infrastructure depends on them staying exactly where they are. That had become me. Every time I fixed something nobody understood, I became harder to replace and easier to exploit. They praised my dedication, then denied resources. They gave me special visibility, then left me off leadership calls where decisions got made. They asked me to train people they paid more than me, then called it collaboration. Twice I was told a director title was coming after the next quarter. Once Martin told me in a hallway, with a hand on my shoulder like he was knighting me, "You're one of those rare people who doesn't need recognition to perform." I smiled when he said it. Inside, something very old and tired in me understood the insult perfectly. 3 months before my father died, a recruiter had reached out to me from a smaller company called Beacon Transit Systems. Better pay, fully remote, smaller team. The CEO had technical roots instead of consulting roots. I took the interview mostly to remind myself I still existed outside Alder. The first conversation lasted 90 minutes. No one asked me how many fires I could absorb. They asked how I thought, what I automated first when inheriting a broken workflow, how I documented risk, what kinds of teams made me better. At the end of the call, the CEO, Elena Park, said, "You sound like someone who has spent a long time making fragile things look stable for people who never see the fragility." I laughed because it was too accurate. 2 weeks later, they made an offer. I didn't accept immediately, not because I wanted Alder, because my father had asked me, a month earlier over bad Chili and Cardinals baseball, whether I was happy. I had given him the same answer children give parents when they are trying not to worry them. "Work's busy. It's fine." He turned the game down with the remote and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Busy and fine aren't the same thing. I remember saying, "I know." He tapped the coffee table twice, thinking, "Your problem, Adrian, is you think endurance is character." That irritated me enough that I got defensive. "It is character." "No," he said. "Sometimes it's fear wearing work boots." I can still hear the exact shape of that sentence. Fear wearing work boots. I had accepted Beacon's offer in principle the week before he died, but I had not signed the final paperwork yet. I was waiting until the Norwalk Foods migration ended because I had been trained by family and by work and by my own stubbornness to make sure the structure stayed standing even if I had already decided to leave the building. Norwalk mattered because it was big. The biggest migration Alder had taken in 18 months. If it worked, Martin would get his keynote talking points and Dana would probably get another bonus. If it failed, the company would bleed. They had staffed it too lean, compressed the testing window, and ignored every caution I wrote. Standard procedure. By the morning Dana told me I could have 2 days for my father's funeral, the entire project was already balancing on undocumented procedures I had built to keep it from tipping. That part matters too, because people later acted like what happened next came from grief alone. It didn't. Grief lit the match. What followed was 6 years of accumulated clarity. I drove home from the office in a kind of perfect silence. No music, no calls, just the sound of rain and tires and the little clicking noise my turn signal made at the empty intersection by my apartment complex. Inside, my place looked exactly the way it always did when life had outrun me. Clean enough to pass casual inspection. 1 coffee mug in the sink, laptop bag by the chair, 2 unopened mailers on the counter. The kind of apartment built for temporary stability. Beige walls, gray couch, windows facing another building's windows. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door and stood there in the half-dark with my coat still on. Then I called Nora. She answered on the first ring. Did they give you the time off? A beat. No, she went quiet. That was worse than if she had shouted. What do you mean no? Dana offered me 2 days. For Dad's funeral? Apparently the dead need to be efficient now. Her breath caught in that sharp way people do when anger and grief collide. Quit. I sat down finally, hard enough that the couch springs complained. I might. No, she said. Not might. Adrian, listen to me. He would lose his mind if he knew they said that to you. I rubbed my eyes. I know. He spent his whole life teaching us not to let people use us, just because we're reliable. A laugh escaped me then, ugly and brief. That is not how either of us turned out. Maybe not, she said. Maybe this is the part where it does. After we hung up, I opened my laptop. I want to be careful here because the line matters. I did not steal client data. I did not sabotage systems that weren't mine. I did not plant malicious code or corrupt records or break anything for the thrill of it. I removed what I had built, what I had privately authored, what I had kept in my own secured repository specifically because official resourcing had never materialized, and because I knew, deep down, the company would one day try to claim my unpaid labor as policy. The best revenge stories involve fantasy. Real ones involve documentation. For years, I had maintained personal working frameworks on my own encrypted drives. Templates, scripts, troubleshooting maps, process notes, migration sequence logic, client environment comparison charts stripped of proprietary identifiers, custom query wrappers, error libraries, rollback trees, prudential rotation reminders, hand-built translation notes for legacy field mismatches. Tools, not company property in the way Dana would later insist. Extensions of my own brain because the company refused to build institutional memory and expected me to be memory instead. I logged in remotely and started sorting. Every file had a provenance note. Every personal script had an origin tag. Everything I had built on my own time or as independent reference material came back to me. Anything that was clearly corporate work product stayed where it was. You learned, in places like Alder, to build a second life in secret, a second set of records, a second understanding of where the truth lives. By midnight, I had transferred what was mine and replaced the empty directories with plain text notices directing authorized staff to internal documentation owners, knowing full well there were none. I removed my unofficial process maps from shared folders that only existed because people had begged me to drop something in there for now. I cleaned permissions. I archived correspondence. I forwarded 3 months' worth of ignored risk memos to a personal legal folder because if they tried to claim negligence later, I wanted timestamps. At 1:23 a.m., I drafted my resignation. Not emotional, not theatrical, effective immediately. I cited the denial of reasonable bereavement leave, a long pattern of uncompensated labor expansion, and a professional environment incompatible with ethical operations. I copied HR, Dana, Martin, and legal. Then I attached my personal property claim list in case anyone got creative. I did not send it right away. Instead, I pulled up the unsigned final contract from Beacon. The salary was better by enough to matter. The benefits were real. The start date was flexible. There was also a signing bonus I had barely let myself think about. I signed at 1:41 a.m. Then I sent the resignation. Then I turned my phone face down and packed a bag for Missouri. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt hollow and precise, like a man holding a flashlight in a room after the power goes out, finally seeing what all the furniture really looks like. The drive to my father's town took 7 hours with weather and 1 stop for gas. Missouri in late October has a way of looking both exhausted and honest. Flat fields, bare trees, sky the color of dishwater, rusting barns that somehow outlast newer things. I drove most of it with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the folder that held the funeral home paperwork. His house sat at the end of a short gravel lane outside Cape Girardeau, built in the 70s and kept alive by steady repairs. Red brick, aluminum awning, shed out back with a warped side door he always meant to replace, but never did because warped isn't broken. When I stepped inside, the first thing I saw was his reading glasses folded neatly on the kitchen table next to a crossword book and half a sleeve of saltines. The second thing I saw was the pill organizer. Friday full, Saturday empty. He had expected to be there Saturday. That almost dropped me. Nora arrived 2 hours later, still in scrubs under her coat because she had driven straight from her hospital rotation after getting clearance. She came through the front door, saw me in the kitchen, and folded in half around me like she had been holding herself together by force of will alone. We stayed like that a long time. My sister has always cried the way storms arrive in the Midwest. Fast, total, then over. I envy that sometimes. I don't do grief in weather. I do it in pressure. Internal, rising quietly until something structural gives. We spent that first evening doing the brutal small things death requires. Choosing the shirt, calling our Uncle Ray, finding the military service records from my grandfather because Dad wanted his folded flag displayed even though he wasn't the veteran himself and kept saying it belonged to our line, not one person. Sorting the kitchen into what would spoil and what could stay. Listening to neighbors knock and say some version of "I'm so sorry" while holding casseroles covered in foil. Late that night, after Nora finally fell asleep in Dad's recliner with one foot tucked under her like she was 14 again, I went into the garage. It smelled like cedar dust and motor oil and winter coats. His workbench was cleaner than mine had ever been. Labels on drawer fronts. Screws sorted by size in old peanut butter jars. 2 clamps still set up around a walnut board with a penciled curve along one edge. A half-finished keepsake box, I realized after a minute. He had been making one. For someone. Maybe for Nora's graduation. Maybe for me. Maybe just because his hands didn't know how to be idle. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Dana. Then Martin. Then HR. Then unknown numbers. I ignored them all until an email came through with the subject line "Return of Company Materials." That was fast. I opened it standing at my father's workbench under the yellow cone of the hanging shop light. The message was legalistic and stupid, the way frightened corporate language often is. It accused me of inappropriate removal of operational assets, referenced potential breach, and requested an urgent call to resolve misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. I looked around that garage at all the evidence of a man who had spent his life fixing things people used without noticing. Hinges, lamps, fence latches, old radios, classroom desks from the district that would have been thrown away if he hadn't hauled them home and rebuilt them for someone's kid. And I thought, no, not this time. I replied with 3 sentences. I am attending my father's funeral. I will not discuss any matter outside council until Monday afternoon. Any further contact before then should be sent in writing. I did not have counsel yet, but Martin didn't know that. The funeral was on Saturday. I thought I was prepared for it. I was not. There are people whose funerals are attended out of obligation, and there are people whose funerals reveal the quiet geography of their kindness. My father's was the second kind. The chapel filled early, not with polished executives or dramatic mourners, but with school custodians, retired teachers, old neighbors, 2 mechanics from the county garage, a librarian he used to flirt harmlessly with every spring, one of Nora's professors, 3 men from the VFW hall, and a woman in a mustard coat who turned out to be the mother of a boy my father had mentored in woodshop after the kid got suspended twice and nearly dropped out. I don't know if you know this, she told me, gripping my hand with both of hers, but your dad came to our house every Wednesday for 4 months and helped my son build a dining table from scratch. Said boys behave better when they could point to something they made. I didn't know that. I kept learning new versions of him all day. A custodian said Dad once stayed until midnight helping clean a flooded corridor so the school wouldn't have to cancel classes. A teacher said he fixed stage lights for the drama club every semester and refused to let the arts budget pay him back. A crossing guard said he brought her coffee all winter after her husband left. People kept giving us these small, precise stories, and each one hurt in a way that felt holy. Halfway through the service, while the pastor was talking about service not as sainthood but as consistency, my phone vibrated again. I looked down. Martin. Declined. Then Dana. Declined. Then a message from Priya. I'm so sorry about your dad. Also, they are in absolute freefall here. Call me when you can. That was the first time I smiled all day. After the burial, after the handshakes and paper plates and the awkward cluster of people in the fellowship hall pretending to eat because food gives grief somewhere to stand, I stepped outside into the cold and called her. She answered on the first ring. Tell me everything, I said. There was no greeting. That was Priya. Oh, it's worse than I hoped, she said. Wind moved through the bare trees beside the church parking lot. I could hear keyboard clatter on her end and someone in the background saying, "Has anyone heard from Martin?" She lowered her voice. "The Norwalk validation environment collapsed yesterday because nobody knew your dependency ordering. They tried 3 workarounds. One made it worse. Dana told the client it was a temporary sync issue. It was not a temporary sync issue." I closed my eyes. Who's handling it? Currently, a rotating cast of panic and bad assumptions. Also, Martin apparently told legal you hid critical process documentation. I laughed once, disbelieving but not surprised. Did he? Yeah, small problem. I forwarded myself 6 of your emails from August and September where you explicitly requested formal documentation ownership, additional staffing, and sign-off boundaries. So, that may age badly for him. I stared out at the cemetery. Rows of stones, thin winter light, fresh dirt over the casket of the only man who had ever loved me without agenda. "Priya," I said quietly, "you should not be doing that for me." She was silent a second. "I'm not doing it for you," she said. "I'm doing it because I'm tired of watching people like Martin call structural negligence a personality issue. Also because your dad just died and those vultures are already trying to make this your fault." That was when the second shift happened. The first had been in Dana's doorway, when my anger went still. The second was standing in church clothes beside my father's grave, realizing Alder was going to do what institutions always do when the wrong person leaves at the wrong time. They were going to rewrite the story, and I was finally too tired to let them. On Monday morning, Nora and I sat in a law office that smelled like lemon polish and old file paper while my father's attorney, a deliberate man named Stephen Hale, walked us through the estate. Dad had not been rich, not even close. He had been careful. That is different. The house was paid off. Small pension, modest life insurance, savings bonds from decades ago. A brokerage account neither Nora nor I knew existed because he had opened it after Mom died and contributed to it every month, no matter how thin things got. There was enough that the future no longer felt like an emergency. Enough that Nora could pay off her remaining loans and start her first job without drowning. Enough that I, for the first time in my adult life, felt the floor under me thicken. Then Stephen slid one more envelope across the desk. "This is separate," he said. "He asked that you read it after we covered the essentials." It was addressed in Dad's blocky handwriting. "For Adrian. Alone." I waited until that evening to open it. The letter was 3 pages, written in blue ink on yellow legal paper. He wrote that he knew I was carrying too much and disguising it as responsibility. He wrote that he was proud of me, but pride was not permission to disappear inside usefulness. He wrote that I had spent half my life proving I could be counted on, and maybe it was time to ask whether the people counting on me deserved the count. He wrote that if I was reading this, then life had already made one decision for me, and he hoped I would not waste the cruelty of that by returning to places that only valued me when I was saving them. At the bottom, he had added one last line. "Take back your name from people who only use it when they need something fixed." I read that line 4 times. Then I folded the letter, set it on the kitchen table, and called Martin. He answered so fast it was almost funny. "Adrian," he said, voice too warm. "First, let me say again how deeply sorry we all are." I let the silence stretch long enough to make him hear himself. "Why are you calling?" I asked. "A beat. We need to discuss resolution." There it was. Not concern. Resolution. I leaned back in Dad's chair and looked out at the dark yard. "You accused me of removing company property. We believe essential operational materials were withdrawn in a way that caused." "No," I said. "You claimed ownership over unpaid labor created because leadership refused to resource mission-critical work. Let's use accurate nouns." His exhale sharpened. "Adrian, I'm trying to solve this professionally." "Then start professionally. Put your specific allegations in writing. Itemize what you believe was improperly removed. Cite the ownership basis. Then explain why multiple documented requests for documentation staffing were ignored." He went quiet. That surprised him. Good. He had expected grief to make me soft or reckless. Instead, it had made me exact. "Would you be willing," he said carefully, "to consult temporarily while we sort through the details?" There it was. The shift from accusation to need. Faster than I thought, honestly. "Maybe," I said. "What would that look like?" I already knew. Independent consulting agreement. Triple my previous hourly rate. 10-hour minimum blocks, prepaid. Limited availability. Written scope only. and any communication about alleged property claims pauses while the consulting relationship is active. He did not answer immediately. That's substantial. So is the hole you're in. Martin, I added, because names matter when you want someone to feel the room change. Your team told me my father's funeral was a scheduling problem. You don't get distressed pricing. He tried another angle. Dana was under pressure and could have handled that conversation better. I laughed at that. Not kindly. That is one way to phrase it. What if we discuss returning you in a larger role? We've been reviewing compensation bands, and no, he was quiet again. You're saying there's no path back? There never was, I said. You just noticed that now. By Wednesday, they had signed. Not happily. Not cleanly. Legal took a few swipes at narrowing terms. I refused each one. They pushed for intellectual property assignment over any guidance I provided. I wrote back that advisory insight was not transferable ownership. They asked for availability across business hours. I gave them 2 controlled windows per week. They objected to prepayment. I let 12 hours pass before replying with the same terms. They paid. The first consulting session began Thursday morning while I sat at my father's kitchen table with black coffee in his favorite chipped mug. Alder joined from a conference room back in Columbus. Martin, Dana, 2 engineers I barely knew, 1 finance director, legal counsel, all looking like people who had slept in their clothes. Dana did not say hello. She stared at me the way people stare at a witness they hoped would remain theoretical. Martin did the opening. Thanks for making time. I let that one pass too. Then I said, screen share. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through the truth of their own environment. Not theatrically, clinically. What sequence dependencies they had ignored. Which integrations had unofficial fallback behaviors everyone relied on, but nobody documented. Why the validation tables kept ghosting incomplete records after rollback. Why the warehouse mapping tool spat out false duplicates when an upstream field changed type. How the junior team had been trained on the happy path flow only and was now improvising blind under production pressure. Every 10 minutes, some earlier warning email of mine came back to life. I had timestamps, attachments, meeting notes. Here, I'd say, September 12th. I raised this. Or, you'll find the rejected staffing request attached to the October steering summary. Or, the reason no one else knows that workaround is because the budget request for cross-training was denied twice. Nothing enrages management like evidence with a memory. Halfway through, Dana interrupted. This retrospective isn't helping. I looked straight at her through the camera. You're not paying for comfort. You're paying for accuracy. The room went still. Martin stepped in quickly, trying to smooth it. Keep going. So I did. By the end of the session, they understood something they should have understood years earlier. The problem was not that I had taken everything. The problem was that they had built an entire revenue pipeline on the assumption that one person would indefinitely convert negligence into stability for free. That realization did not humble Dana. It made her meaner. People like her can tolerate many things. Dependence is not one of them. The following Tuesday, a rumor started inside Alder that I had timed my departure to maximize leverage over the Norwalk migration. Priya told me this over a late call while I sat in the garage sanding the walnut box my father never finished. They're saying you weaponized institutional knowledge. I kept sanding. I did no such thing. I know. But Dana needs a villain because the alternative is admitting she built a system around invisible labor and then insulted it on the way out. I blew sawdust off the lid. Who's repeating it? Mostly managers. Some people believe it. Some don't. Cameron from finance does not. Also, Jules in HR looks like she's reconsidering her life. Jules always looked like that. Priya laughed softly. Then her voice changed. There's more. I set the sandpaper down. What? Norwalk is requesting an executive review. Not just technical. Contractual. That got my attention. Why? Because Dana apparently promised a deployment readiness status that did not exist. In writing, there it was. Overconfidence. The mistake big enough to carry consequence. One of the requirements you gave me for stories like this is that the betrayers become overconfident and make an error that turns the structure against them. In real life, they almost always do. Because once people are used to getting away with narrative management, they forget records exist outside the story they are telling themselves. Dana had told Norwalk, repeatedly, that all critical migration controls were institutionally documented and team accessible. That was false. And now legal was nervous. You could feel the shift in the next consulting call. The finance director spoke more than before. Legal asked narrower questions. Martin looked grayer. Dana smiled too much, which was how she looked when she was trying not to bare her teeth. At the end of the call, Martin said, "Can you stay on for a few extra minutes? My contract window ends in 2. This will just take a second." "No," he blinked. "If you want more time, book more time." That tiny refusal hit harder than any speech could have, because for years they had assumed access to me was ambient, flexible, moral. They thought my time expanded under pressure because it always had. Now it had edges. They hated the edges. A week later, while Nora was back in St. Louis starting her new unit orientation and I was packing up the last of my father's tools to move some of them to a storage unit, I got an email from Alder's outside counsel. Formal request for mediation regarding disputed ownership and transitional damages. I read it twice in the driveway beside Dad's truck. Then I called Stephen Hale, my father's attorney, and asked for an employment litigator recommendation. That is how I met Leah Fenwick. Leah was one of those lawyers who never raised her voice because she didn't need to. Mid-40s, silver hoop earrings, neat dark hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had watched executives lie under oath often enough to stop being impressed by titles. I brought her every record I had. Contracts, emails, personal file provenance logs, staffing requests, performance reviews, compensation histories, the bereavement denial, Dana's messages, Martin's accusations, my consulting agreement, payment receipts, Priya's forwarded internal notes I probably should not have had, but was very grateful existed. Leah read for an hour without much expression. Then she looked up and said, "Did they really deny bereavement leave in writing?" Functionally, yes. The verbal denial was followed by a formal schedule limitation email. She sat back. Well, that was stupid of them. It is hard to explain how soothing that sentence felt. Not because it solved anything, because it translated my outrage into legal grammar. Leah's view was simple. I had strong grounds. They had weak ones. The more they pushed, the more discovery exposure they created around classification of uncompensated labor, ignored staffing warnings, and representations made to clients about operational readiness. She drafted a response that was beautiful in the way a scalpel is beautiful. Precise, cold, not dramatic, just devastating. Alder backed off mediation within 6 days. And that, in a more ordinary life, might have been the end of it. But Alder was not done making mistakes. Because once a system starts cracking, pressure reveals everything it was hiding. Priya called me the following Friday from her car. "Are you sitting down? I'm in a storage unit with half my father's socket set." So yes, emotionally. She ignored that. Dana got put on leave. I straightened. What? Temporary administrative leave pending review. Martin too, but his was framed as stepping aside to focus on client remediation. I leaned against the storage rack. What happened? Cameron in finance apparently refused to sign off on another client readiness statement because the numbers didn't match deliverable reality. That triggered a wider review. Norwalk wasn't the only account with optimistic reporting, just the biggest. There was a long silence between us. Then she said, quieter, "You weren't the first person they built around and undercredited. You were just the one who left with receipts." That landed hard. Because part of what makes revenge satisfying is not just seeing one cruelty answered. It is watching the pattern behind it dragged into light. Over the next month, details surfaced in pieces. Alder had routinely underreported implementation risk to preserve renewals. Several team members had flagged burnout and undocumented dependencies over 2 years. Compensation compression on technically essential staff was worse than anyone outside finance realized. Training budgets had been denied while executive travel budgets rose. And, most relevant to me, Dana had repeatedly categorized my self-authored continuity tools as ad hoc support in order to avoid opening a formal resourcing request that would have exposed how dependent the company really was on one undertitled analyst. In plain English, she had hidden my value because acknowledging it would have forced her to spend money and share credit. Martin had signed off on it because short-term optics mattered more to him than structural reality. You asked for a story where the audience gradually learns the protagonist was not as powerless as others assumed. This was that stage in my life. Not because I had been secretly wealthy or politically connected or some mastermind 3 moves ahead. I was never that. I was just the person who understood the architecture better than the people making speeches about it. And once I stopped protecting them from the truth of that, they had no idea how to hold their own roof up. Beacon, meanwhile, turned out to be real. That may not sound dramatic, but after years in a company where sincerity had to wear armor, real felt almost suspicious at first. My first week there, Elena Park scheduled a one-on-one and spent the first 15 minutes asking about my father. Not performatively, not because grief was a bonding exercise, because she had read the timing on my start documents, connected the obvious dots, and was decent enough to act like human events outranked deliverables. She told me to take whatever flexibility I needed during the estate transition and meant it. When I apologized for being distracted one morning after a probate call, she said, "If work can't survive your real life, then work is built wrong." I had to mute for a second after that because something behind my ribs gave way. Beacon was smaller, messier in some ways, but honest about where it was messy. There were only 11 of us. No one spoke in slogans. Problems got named faster. Credit traveled more accurately. I still worked hard, maybe harder, but effort there did not feel like tribute paid to indifference. It felt like building. That difference changed me more than I expected. For months after I left Alder, I kept waking up at 3 a.m. convinced I had forgotten some catastrophic dependency somewhere. My body still believed disaster was waiting if I stopped scanning. I would sit at my kitchen table in the dark with my father's letter open beside me and read the line about endurance being fear in work boots until my breathing slowed down. Nora moved into her first apartment near the hospital and called me 3 nights in a row because she couldn't decide where Dad's old clock should go. "Your place," I said. "No, yours. He fixed it more times." "Exactly. It belongs with the child most likely to over-engineer its shelf support." That made me laugh. We split more of his tools than furniture, which would have amused him. The keepsake box from the garage, the one he had left unfinished, I completed over the winter in small increments. Sanding the edges, cutting the lining, fitting the brass hinge. The first time I closed the lid and heard it settle flush, I cried for the first time since the hospital. Not because of the box, because finishing something he had started felt, for one impossible second, like talking back to death. Around February, Priya quit Alder. Of course she did. She called me from the parking lot after handing in her badge. "I wish I could tell you I said something cinematic," she said. I did not. I just smiled at Dana's interim replacement and said I was no longer interested in contributing to a company whose risk model was denial. That's pretty good, actually. It got better. Guess where I'm going? I had a feeling. Beacon. Beacon. Elena had recruited her after I mentioned, carefully, that a certain engineer I knew had the unusual skill of combining technical clarity with the ability not to murder executives in public. Priya started 6 weeks later. The first day she joined a team call, she twisted a water bottle cap between her fingers, looked around at our little grid of faces, and said, "This is unsettlingly healthy. Is there a hidden cult element?" "No cult," Elena said. "Just boundaries." Priya nodded solemnly. Terrifying. Some endings do not come as explosions. They come as contrast. You step into a room where nobody is feeding on your exhaustion, and suddenly the old room reveals itself for what it was. Still, the old room had a final act left in it. In March, Cameron from Alder's finance department emailed me from a personal address. I nearly ignored it. Subject line, "You should know." Inside was a short note. "Thought this might matter to you. Martin resigned. Dana was terminated. Norwalk settled. Board review ongoing. You weren't wrong. No greeting. No signature. Just that." I stared at it for a long time. You would think I felt victorious. Maybe some part of me did. But the emotion that rose first was stranger than victory. It was release. Because once the people who hurt you are finally named by the consequences they earned, you stop carrying the burden of proving the wound existed. I did not reply. Instead, I printed the email, folded it, and tucked it into the coffee tin where my father kept receipts. He would have liked that. A month later, I got a LinkedIn message from Martin. Not a legal threat, not a job offer, not even an excuse, really. More like a confession in business casual language. He wrote that leadership failures had been identified, that he regretted aspects of how my departure had been handled, that he had been doing a lot of reflection, and that he wanted me to know my concerns had ultimately led to meaningful organizational review. I read it twice and felt nothing. That startled me too. There had been a time when a message like that would have consumed me for a week. I would have edited imaginary replies in the shower, rehearsed the perfect ratio of dignity to contempt, wondered whether forgiveness was strength or surrender. Instead, I just saw a man trying to stand nearer the truth without fully stepping into it. I wrote back one sentence. My father taught me to trust what people do when it costs them something. Then I archived the message. Dana's message came later and was somehow worse because it was more honest. She wrote 6 months after the funeral, after the lawsuits, after the board review, after Beacon had already become normal life instead of rescue. She said she had thought toughness meant never giving ground to emotion in operational environments. She said she now understood she had confused discipline with dehumanization. She said she did not expect forgiveness, but wanted to acknowledge that denying leave after my father's death had been cruel. Cruel. There it was. The word she hadn't been able to use when it mattered. I did not answer right away. That evening, I drove out to the cemetery alone. The grass had grown in over the grave by then. The headstone was set. Simple. His name, dates, and beneath them a line Nora chose because it sounded most like him. Built T.O. last. I stood there with Dana's message open on my phone and the wind moving through the cemetery maples, and I tried to decide what I owed the dead, the living, and myself. Forgiveness is sometimes treated like a moral graduation. It isn't. Sometimes it is wise. Sometimes it is vanity. Sometimes it is just another way grief gets asked to perform. What I settled on was smaller and truer. I wrote back, "What you did changed the course of my life. So did what happened after. I won't pretend those things cancel each other out. I hope you become someone who would never say that to another person again." Then I put my phone away. At work, things kept growing. Beacon won a mid-market rail systems client because Priya rebuilt one of our implementation demos into something so clean it made the prospect's CTO laugh out loud and say, "Finally, someone here has touched reality." Elena promoted me to Director of Systems Strategy by the end of summer, not as a panic offer, not because a crisis cornered them, but because it matched the work I was already doing and they believed titles should correspond to truth. The first time she told me, I almost refused out of reflex. Not because I didn't want it, because some bruised part of me still distrusted recognition. She saw that instantly. "You don't have to earn the right to be accurately described," she said. "It is deeply inconvenient when good bosses use language that makes you want to rebuild your nervous system on company time." Nora finished her first year as an ER nurse without quitting or committing homicide, both significant achievements. She started dating a respiratory therapist named Luis who brought tools to family dinners without being asked, which earned him immediate supernatural approval in my mind. Together we cleaned out the last storage unit over Labor Day weekend and moved Dad's workbench into my garage. That garage became something I had not expected, a place to think. A place to make things with no monetization strategy attached. I restored an old cedar chest over one winter, built shelves, fixed a broken lamp Nora found on the curb, started keeping receipts in the same kind of coffee tin Dad used, which made me laugh the first time I noticed it. Some habits are inheritance wearing overalls. One cold Saturday, almost a year after he died, I found the walnut pendant he had half finished in a small drawer under the bench. I had forgotten about it. Oval-shaped, smooth on one side, rough on the other. Meant to be worn on a cord maybe, though he never drilled the final hole through the top. I sat down under the shop light and finished it. Slowly. Sandpaper, drill, oil, cloth. Nothing dramatic. But as the grain darkened and the shape settled into my palm, I thought about all the versions of myself that had stood in doorways waiting for permission from people who benefited from saying no. At work, in life, in smaller friendships I had outgrown, in ambitions I had softened so they wouldn't threaten anyone. The pendant grew warm in my hand. I understood then that the real thing I had taken back that night was not documentation or leverage or money or even professional dignity, though I took those too. It was authorship. That sounds lofty. It isn't. It just means I stopped letting people who did not love me define the meaning of my usefulness. There's one more piece you should know. About a year and a half after everything happened, I was invited to speak on an operations panel at a regional systems conference. Nothing glamorous. Mid-tier hotel ballroom, bad pastries, lanyards, too much fluorescent light. My topic was continuity design in lean technical environments. Elena thought I'd be good at it. Priya said if I wore a blazer she would deny knowing me. Halfway through the networking break, I turned from the coffee station and saw Martin across the room. He looked older. Not dramatically, just less reinforced, like some internal scaffolding had been removed. For a second, I thought he might avoid me. He didn't. He walked over with the careful posture of a man approaching a former witness. Adrian. Martin. He glanced at my badge, then back at me. Congratulations, he said. I hear Beacon's doing well. It is. A pause. Then, I deserved how that ended. That surprised me enough that I did not speak immediately. He gave a small, humorless smile. I kept telling myself pressure explained everything. It didn't. It just revealed preference. There it was again. My father's lesson in a different mouth. Watch what people do when it costs them something. I'm sorry about your father, he said. And about that day. I believe he meant it. I also understood, maybe for the first time, that meaning it late is not the same as having been different when it counted. Thank you, I said. He nodded once and stepped back. No ask. No angle. No self-exoneration disguised as insight. Just a man standing in the shape of the consequence he had made. After he walked away, Priya materialized beside me holding 2 coffees. Well, she said, handing me one, if that wasn't a haunted Victorian child's idea of closure. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled it. Maybe that is the real ending. Not the resignation. Not the consulting contract. Not Dana's fall. Not the board review. Not even the title. I finally got somewhere that understood what titles are for. Maybe the real ending was that laughter. Because by then the story no longer belonged to the worst day. It belonged to everything that came after I stopped confusing being needed with being valued. Some people hear what happened and fixate on the line in my resignation or the price of the consulting agreement or the fact that Alder cratered after they treated my father's funeral like an inconvenience. But that is not the part one keep. The part one keep is smaller. A kitchen table in Missouri. Legal papers stacked beside a chipped mug. My father's handwriting on yellow paper telling me not to waste the cruelty of what happened by going back to places that only noticed my worth when I withdrew it. My sister asleep in his recliner after 2 days of crying so hard she looked transparent. The garage light humming over unfinished walnut. The first morning at Beacon when nobody asked me to prove that being human could coexist with competence. That's the part that lasted. People love stories where somebody burns the whole building down on the way out. I understand the appeal. I do. But most of the time, the deeper revenge is quieter than that. You leave with your work. You leave with your name. You leave with your evidence. You leave with the piece of yourself they had taught you to hand over for free. And then you let the people who called you replaceable discover the weight of the space you were holding. My father used to say that the strongest structures in the world are not the ones that never crack. They are the ones built by people who finally learn where not to place the load. I carry that with me now. In the work I do. In the boundaries I keep. In the walnut pendant that hangs from a hook above my workbench. In the fact that when my phone rings after hours, I no longer feel a spike of guilt before deciding whether to answer. In the fact that I can look back at that office, that doorway, that paper cup of bad coffee, and feel something better than rage. Distance. They told me to choose between my father and my job. What they never understood was that the moment they made me choose, they had already lost. Because I did go home. I buried my father. I finished what he started. I took back everything they thought would always be theirs. And then I built a life that no longer required their permission to matter. That was the part they couldn't recover. That was the part one kept.